focus and talk about the second edition of the India development debate this evening, and alarm bells are ringing aloud for MTNL and BSNL. Top officials of the telecom department did meet Prime Minister Narendra Modi seeking funds to keep the two government-owned telecom service providers afloat. The signs are ominous. The combined loss of BSNL and MTNL now stands at close to 8,000 crore rupees at a time when the customer base is shrinking steadily. And with a combined debt of almost 30,000 crore rupees, the telecom twins are clearly going the Air India way. Not just that, MTNL, which provides telecom services in just Delhi and Mumbai, needs 9,500 crore rupees for spectrum payments, which are due in April next year. Remember, this money has to come from the taxpayer, who is already overburdened when it comes to bailing out failed PSUs. In fact, it is a matter of shame for the Modi government, which boasts of big-ticket reforms like the GST, to use taxpayers' money to bail out failed PSUs. The road ahead for telecom twins and is putting a lot of taxpayer money in ailing PSUs at all a solution anymore. That's the big topic of discussion and debate right here on the India Development Debate this evening. I'm Supriya Shrinate, and joining us is a special panel right here. Dr. Ajay Dua, former DIPP Secretary, R. Jagannathan, Editorial Director, Swarajya Magazine, and Sadanand Dume, Resident Fellow, American Enterprise Institute. Thanks each one of you for being with us. The trigger for this, of course, is MTNL and BSNL bailout, but this does point us in the direction of a larger debate, and the debate is on PSUs. And should the government be in the business of running a lot of businesses that it doesn't need to, and perhaps they need to be rethinking on how it's doing so. Jackie, let me begin with you. The whole meeting in the Prime Minister's office over MTNL, BSNL revival, is the government in denial? I mean, do successive governments refuse to acknowledge that the sell-by date of a public sector enterprise and ends up wasting billions of dollars over the years? I mean, even so, the technological changes and digitization is making a lot of these PSUs absolutely obsolete, absolutely redundant.
Yes, it's obvious that public sector has been able to make profits only when it's in a monopoly situation. The minute there is competition and you have different kinds of players coming into the picture, each with their own cost efficiencies and brand building plans, the public sector starts thinking like a stone. And you have seen this repeatedly in sector after sector. You saw it first in aviation, then this telecom has been sinking for a long time to come. Even when private sector players have not been able to handle the heat, I think how is BSNL or MTNL going to do that? Then you have a whole raft of banks in the same boat. So I think it doesn't make sense for public sector to be in areas where the private sector can do just as well, because the taxpayer is needlessly picking up the bill for a service that is not required.
That's a valid point indeed. Why should the taxpayer be, footing a bill for a service that's not required to be rendered by the public sector at all? But Sadanand, I'll come to you before I go across to Dr. Ajay Dua, because I do want to speak some numbers with him. Is the inherent problem one of clinging to the asset with this whole futile hope that we'll turn it around, and then, it becomes too late? You put it up for sale when there has been a significant asset value erosion, the asset is beyond repair, and private sector is not out there buying lemons. So, I mean, if you look at the case of Air India, there wasn't a single buyer, and that's story after story. I mean, that's the story, asset after asset, is it not?
Of course, but I see it slightly differently. I mean, I think this is essentially a political problem. What Jaggi says is absolutely correct, and what you have pointed out is absolutely correct. And neither is it very new. I mean, we have been saying the same things for a long time now. The question that we have to ask is, why are we not able to get this message across to the politicians who rule India, whether it's Congress and the UPA or with BJP and the NDA? As far as the Modi government is concerned, I would argue that this failure to tackle the PSU problem, the failure to privatize companies like Air India and BSNL, is one of its greatest failures. So, the question really is, why are we unable to get what is a commonsensical message, right? In 2018, it is preposterous, not just for the government to be running airlines and telecom firms and so on, but to be running them and losing tons of taxpayer money that could be put to more productive use.
No, I don't doubt what you say at all. I don't dispute it. I don't disagree with it. But let's talk about this particular case of MTNL and the whole revival plan there. Mr. Dua, is MTNL the next Air India? And why is it that the government is not paying heed to its consistently deteriorating operation metric? I mean, look at the numbers. This whole telecom revolution has ensured that most telcos have healthy balance sheets, but of course, the recent competition. MTNL has made losses since 2010. It has 17,000 crore rupees in debt, annual interest burden of 1450 crore rupees. Losses were pegged at 2893 crores in fiscal year 15. It's gone up to 2917 fiscal year 18. Operationally, PSU telecom companies or airlines pale in comparison with private operators. I mean, why does the government insist to be in this business at all? And the larger question is MTNL going to be India's next Air India?
Possibly. I don't rule that out at all. The government, which had in 2014, when quoting the Indian public, the Prime Minister had himself talked about minimum government, maximum governance, and that included handling the 200 odd public sector undertakings of the federal government and probably 600 of them or 650 of them in the provincial governments. I don't think any progress whatsoever, and I'm a bit categorical about it, seems to have been made so far. We have, Supriya, about 100 public sector undertakings owned by the federal government and the state government, which for years haven't produced a single unit of produce, items whatever they were meant for. That includes companies like Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceuticals, HMT, Hindustan Photofilms of the central government, and a whopping 39 of them in the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is currently being ruled by the BJP. It is a case of the central government as well as the state governments wanting to hang on to what is with them, whether it's for purposes of patronage of the politicians, the ministers who run these companies, or I wouldn't say or, and it is their inability to face the labor unions who are virtually running these companies rather than their managements, and MTNL is no exception. MTNL is heavily overstaffed. It is for a long time, it's been there for everyone to see that the earlier we get rid of it, the better value we would realize, but the way we are going about it, I think we would continue to have only the debt with us while the assets are being completely eroded.
Right. Okay. You raise a valid point about asset value erosion, and I'll come to that in just a bit, because while I was doing a research for this show, it startled me of the significant asset value erosion that has happened for companies across sectors that the state owns, whether it's shipping, whether it's power, whether it's finance. MTNL is just one of those cases, and of course aviation. It's startling, but I'll come to that in just a bit. Jaggi, I want to, for the benefit of our viewers, Mr. Dua was pointing out political patronage and all of that. We'll come to that in just a bit. But just for the benefit of our viewers, I want to raise some numbers on our screens. Now, according to a government survey that was tabled in Parliament, BSNL, Air India and MTNL were the worst performing PSUs with highest losses. They made up for 55.6% of the total losses suffered by the top 10 loss-making PSUs in fiscal year 17. Nothing explains the fact that why should they be in this business. There are 82 loss-making CPSCs, that's central PSUs. There are 82 of them. Why should the government be in this business at all? But the staggering losses of just the three of the, the top 10 that I mentioned, BSNL, Air India and MTNL, is 55.6% of the total losses of the top 10. I mean, isn't this a startling number for someone in the government to act on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first of all, we must use the right nomenclature. To call liabilities as assets is the first mistake. The public sector, as substantially as it stands today, is a liability. in most cases where alternative services of equal competence and quality are available, to think that the public sector must somehow bravely soldier on in that area is the first stupidity of government. I mean, I can understand if you say nobody wants to go to Arunachal Pradesh and they need to get telephone services. Okay, I'll subsidize BSNL to provide that. But to come and compete in Mumbai and Delhi, where there is an excess of telecom capacity available to people, to compete in the wrong spaces for the wrong reasons, I think it's a stupidity. I think all these assets are liabilities, and the government's first job, any government's first job should be to cut its losses and save the taxpayer from future problems. If it comes to people, we are talking about workers, I think it is far safer to give them a very comfortable and golden handshake, a VRS over the next 5 years, or even a long pension plan, add that to the government's liabilities and sell the rest of the assets. I think you should not be afraid of fighting the unions if you say, look, I am going to take care of these guys. I mean, that's the only thing I can see why governments may be afraid of it. I mean, once you've taken care of these workers, what do you need these companies for?
No, what do you need these companies for? There's an important point that you raised. When private sector comes in any case, you're cornered. Sadanand, you come to India very often, and in places like Delhi and Mumbai, those are the only two cities where MTNL really operates. It has sought 4,000 crore rupees in network expansion and upgradation. Now, should the government put that money in MTNL at all just to keep it afloat? Because what is MTNL's game plan is the big question. To succeed in either Delhi or Mumbai, these are markets completely dominated by Airtel and Vodafone. And now, of course, you've got a new player like Jio, and all three of them have got a clear vision in telecom. They've got a game plan and they've got the big bucks. MTNL doesn't even have 4G. They don't have 4G spectrum. They don't even offer that, which everybody else is doing. So my question really is that, I mean, what is the game plan here?
I mean, I don't even think that matters. I think at this point, it's pretty obvious that these are essentially zombie companies. They don't have a game plan, and you can't blame them. It's the nature of being a public sector company. The real question is, why have these elementary philosophical insights not percolated into the system? Why do we have politicians and bureaucrats who manage to stall this? If you look at the debate in India, it's as though the needle has not moved. We have not seen a privatization since 2004, right? So since the defeat of Vajpayee in 2004, there is a broad consensus among politicians that touching privatization is a kind of political third rail. Many of us had hoped that Narendra Modi was the man to put an end to this, that Narendra Modi, who spoke of minimum government and who spoke of the government having no business doing business, was the person who was going to fix this problem. 4 years later, heading into the next election, he's done nothing. The way they think about this problem is part of the issue. Whenever you hear the finance minister, he speaks about revenue targets. He arrives at them through sleight of hand by selling bits and pieces of one public sector company to another public sector company. There is virtually no talk of efficiency. There is no talk of being able to use that same money more productively later. And there's no talk of the simple fact that these are essentially subsidies for the middle class and the rich. These are not helping the poor. So, any which way you look at it, you could make a compelling case. I believe you could make a compelling political case for privatizing these companies, for getting them off the balance sheet, for, as Jaggi says, treating them as liabilities, not as assets. But for that, you need at least a small bit of political courage, and that we have not seen.
Right. No, I couldn't agree with you more on that. This is not subsidy for the poor. I mean, all the bleeding hearts who talk about PSUs, this is not subsidy for the poor, this is subsidy for the rich. But, just to be the devil's advocate for a minute, the idea of the show is not to really bash MTNL or such public sector enterprises, but just to be the devil's advocate. And Dr. Dua, coming to you, we are very quick to point out inefficiencies and the lack of best practices in PSUs. But isn't government apathy the biggest factor of them all? Let's take the case of MTNL. I'm startled to know that it got a full-time chairman and managing director after 4 years. And you know what was the irony? After 4 years, they went back to the same man who had actually taken additional charge when he was director of finance in 2014. That was Mr. Purwar. They've gone back to the same man. He took charge when A.K. Garg retired in 2014. He was then upstaged by another person who came in, some Mr. Kumar, Naveen Yadav, sorry, Narendra Kumar Yadav, and then they've gone back to him. I mean, what kind of flip-flop this is? Does the communication minister, does the government, does the personnel ministry doesn't realize that MTNL is without a head for 4 years?
And yet they don't flog it off. That's the irony of it. They all know about it. Every vacancy in a public sector is intimated to the government well in advance by the management of the public sector, the personnel divisions there. When the vacancies are arising, the process of filling them up to what's called the Public Enterprises Selection Board is required to be initiated 6 months, at least 6 months before a vacancy is arising. Despite all this being there, the government in this particular case has obviously not been very keen to have this company. If you have a top management in position, probably the company would have done a little better than what it has, other than the fact that there are structural issues for it not to be in that business. Having said that, let me just, Supriya, talk about an issue which is that public sector is something which no politician is willing to give up, either individually or collectively, because they are nothing but milk cows for the politicians and the bureaucrats who are running these public sector undertakings. It doesn't require anyone now to identify which companies are the ones bleeding the most. This particular government, after it set up the Niti Aayog, had charged it with the responsibility of identifying the loss-making companies. Niti Aayog has done a good job, identified 73 companies which are losing money, have lost money for quite some time and needed to be flogged off. Not one recommendation of Niti Aayog in this respect has been acted upon or even considered seriously by the administrative ministry and a full-fledged department of yes. Please go ahead.
Deepam. No, you're absolutely right that the Niti Aayog report, forget about being adhered to, the Niti Aayog report has now been put on the back burner, and the decision in the DIPAM or the Ministry of Finance or whatever else it's called is that they will not move on this. That's the biggest irony of this all. Niti Aayog has very recently said that the government should completely get out of assets like Ashoka Hotel in Delhi and even BHEL and the fallen star MTNL. I don't understand what explains the inaction. And Jaggi, I'll ask you this question. And just before I ask you the question, to put it in public domain, why are we saying that the government needs to get out of companies? And here's an example of sector after sector where the PSU has seen significant erosion of its asset value. Let's talk about MTNL. In its heyday, it was this telecom giant, had a monopoly over landlines. It had a market value of 13,000 crore rupees in 2008. It's down to 1,000 crore rupees. BHEL, again a classic case. Back in 2011, market value of 82,000 crore rupees. It's 28,000 crore rupees now. L&T and Thermax have all doubled in value in this period. NTPC, one of India's Navratnas, Maharatnas and whatever, has lost 40% of its value in the last decade. Come to shipping. Shipping Corporation of India has seen an asset value erosion of 70% in 10 years. IFCI in finance, the market cap has shrunk from 18,000 in 2007 to 3,000 crore rupees now. I mean, this is not just services sector like aviation or hotels. The problem here is that whichever sector that the government is present in, that is where the problem is. And Jaggi, you alluded to this point earlier. Is this then a fact that one has to accept and act upon, that the government will only succeed in sectors where there is a state-owned monopoly, and for everywhere else where the private sector is allowed, they will be pushed to a corner, just like the examples I quoted?
Yes, that is one basic assumption. That is, whenever there is a lot of private players, the government sector will not succeed for two reasons. One is, of course, there are inefficiencies and lengthy processes in tackling the competition. Second thing is, the private sector is in a position to actually spike the guns of the public sector, because they can get politicians to stop some tender, do whatever it is, from expanding. This happens easily in India. The second reason why you should actually not keep public sector going is that you can't keep on having something that creates its own vested interest. If you are going on recruiting people because there is a vacancy here, there is this thing, you're going to keep adding to the liabilities for no reason at all. And you should not do this. And if you do not get out of this problem sooner or later, I suspect that there is a slowdown in I think the Modi government has finally come to the conclusion that these are not crown jewels, but these are just dust and crap. But the thing is, they will not do anything till after the election. So the next 9 months, you will see no action. If at all it comes back to power, that's when they may think that they should do something about it. It's a dangerous situation, but next 1 year, we are going to stumble along on this path.
No, I kind of share that concern, and I kind of share that, paranoia that a lot of us have. But Sadanand, also to talk to you about the same point, the examples that I quoted, the asset value erosion that one has seen, is it a blunt reality that government cannot run businesses? Government cannot be doing businesses. It should ideally focus its energy on health, on education, and on things like that. Leave this to the private sector, because where you're not going to be a state-owned monopoly, this is what your fate will be, because you have assets where there has been such a significant asset value erosion that it has no takers now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we're getting a little bit, we're in a bit of a repetitive rut over here. We all agree that the government should not be running firms, especially not firms where the private sector is competitive. We all agree that the government should be focused on doing what it needs to do, focus on things like providing security, providing healthcare, providing education, providing the basics. Focus on that. Don't try to run hotels and run telephone services. It's just sort of absurd on the face of it. We can all see the erosion of shareholder value. We can all see the poor returns to investment. I mean, all of these are not new. This is not a 2018 issue. We could have had the same conversation 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or indeed 15 or 20 or 25 years ago. The real question is, why do the majority of Indians not view this the way the four people having this discussion view it? That to me is the ball. That's the ball that needs to be moved, because unless you find a way to move that ball forward, we're just going to be in the same place. We're just sort of dribbling among ourselves in the World Cup is going on, so forgive the football analogy. We're dribbling among ourselves on in our half of the goal. How do you move the ball onto the other side? And I think that is the conversation that we need to have. And we need to be able to go to politicians and say to them, look, here's how you can get something out of this. Because simply saying over and over and over that this is good policy, why don't you do this? It's very clear now that it doesn't work, because it doesn't convince the people who need to be convinced.
Right. I think you're so right that, politicians don't get voted on these issues, so they couldn't care less. The vote will eventually be on caste coalitions and on communal lines and, some tall promises being made by either sides. That's the irony of times that we live in and of the country that we live in. But I guess that's the price that one pays for democracy. But Dr. Dua, I'm tempted to ask you an example and of a story that we broke today. IDBI privatization has been in the pipeline for just so long, and today we broke this story, and it's a story that IRDA has later confirmed. IDBI's stake will now be sold to LIC. Legislative changes will be made because LIC will have to buy about 43%. I mean, these hoodwink solutions are not going to work also. What sort of privatization is this where LIC is going to buy a stake, because LIC is nothing. LIC is Government of India holding your nose the other way around.
Absolutely. We have used LIC to fulfill our targets of raising targets of revenue from disinvestment. We forced LIC whenever we wanted to keep afloat a company in the public sector. That's happened so often. I don't think this is any kind of privatization which is being attempted, but then the government tried to flog IDBI as well, and it's seen that there are no takers for it, IDBI. And what bothers me is that IDBI Bank is barely 10 years old. in 10 years itself, it has run itself to the ground. You see, the earlier company was the Development Bank, which was separate, IDBI Main and IDBI Bank. We are talking about the IDBI Bank. But having said all that, Supriya, I would like to emphasize the role of regulators, which I am finding has been wanting ever since we got into this business of getting private sector and private sector competing or being in the space with the public sector and a level playing field which they were supposed to provide. Because of the background of the regulators, from where most of them have been coming, they have not really provided a level playing field to the private sector almost in every sector of the economy, whether it was electricity, whether we don't have a regulator in the railways or in the petroleum industry except in petroleum transmission, etc.
No,
one
I
way
agree
to
with you.
make these companies kind of remain afloat is to enforce the regulations, because the laws are all there. The moment this happens, the politicians would start seeing that their companies are losing not 1 lakh crores, but they are actually losing 5 to 6 times as much in the aggregate than what's been coming to the
Dr. Dua, I'm sorry, I'll have to come in there because we are really running short on time on this show. And I have a quick last question for Jaggi and for Sadanand, and will request both of you to be very brief because this is the same question to two of you. We understand that the Congress government in the past, supported by the left especially, in its first stint, didn't take the call on selling these PSUs because, you know, it's not a part of their ideology. But for a majority government, and such a brute majority like this government with core agenda as development, right of the center, free market ideology, what explains the pussyfooting with PSUs? I mean, why has Mr. Modi and his team been so averse to selling these public sector enterprises that have no business being owned by government? Jaggi, let's begin with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we misunderstood Mr. Modi. I don't think he's convinced about privatization. In fact, even before 2014, where I think we had called him for a conference, and the way he spoke about it, he talked about improving their performance. The word privatization was never mentioned, even though he did make one bland statement, government has no business to be in business. But I don't think he was ever convinced that this is the way to go. And I think what Mr. Dua is there, I think conceptually you cannot be a player and a referee. That is, you cannot have a company that is a player in a sector and you can also have a regulator. So I think government needs to get out of those sectors, and I think Mr. Modi, hopefully he has learnt his lessons in the last 4 years. He is saddled with so many loss makers that he has to change his mind now.
Sadanand, do you believe he'll be able to change his mind? He's been very resistant to the word privatization, at least in his first stint.
I mean, that's really what it is. It's the ghost of 2004. Many people in the party feel that that's why they lost in 2004, because Vajpayee moved fast on privatization, and people have just been averse. They've not wanted to touch this.
That's putting it very crisply. The ghost of 2004, it seems, is haunting the Modi government, and which is why it has not been able to bite the bullet on some really big ticket reforms, and one of them has to be PSU privatization. The government really has no business to be running businesses that it is not apt to run. It must concede to the private sector in areas where the private sector has excelled, because pumping taxpayers' money and taxpayers once again footing the bill for loss-making inefficient PSUs is really never going to be the solution. Thanks very much, R. Jagannathan, Sadanand Dume and Dr. Ajay Dua for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate.